Picture two men, both exactly 30 years old, standing at opposite ends of the same city. One walks into a bank and is treated like a threat. The other walks into the same bank and is treated like royalty. Nothing about their age, their voice, or their face is different. The only thing that separates them is a number sitting quietly in a database somewhere, a number most people will never see, yet one that decides how the entire world responds to them. This is not a story about luck. This is a story about how money rewires the way he sees a human being, and once you understand the mechanics behind it, you will never look at wealth, poverty, or your own bank balance the same way again. Let's start with the broke 30-year-old, because his story is the one most people quietly recognize in themselves. He wakes up already behind. Not behind on some abstract life goal, but behind on rent, behind on a credit card minimum payment, behind on a version of adulthood he was promised as a teenager. Society told him that if he worked hard, stayed disciplined, and made reasonable choices, stability would eventually arrive. Nobody told him that the economic flaw beneath that promise had been quietly removed decades before he was even born. He applies for an apartment and gets rejected, not because he is irresponsible, but because his income-to-rent ratio fails an algorithm that was never designed with his generation's wages in mind. He tries to get a car loan, and the interest rate handed to him is nearly double what a wealthier applicant would receive for the exact same vehicle, which means poverty does not just cost you money, it costs you more money to access the same things wealthier people get cheaper. Economists have a name for this. It's called the poverty premium, and it is one of the most brutal, least discussed forces in modern finance. The less you have, the more everything costs you, and the more everything costs you, the harder it becomes to ever have more. Now walk into a boardroom, a private lounge, a 5-star hotel lobby, and place a 30-year-old millionaire in that same city. Watch how differently the world responds to him, even if, and this is the uncomfortable part, even if his personality, his manners, his intelligence are no better than the man we just described. Bankers call him back within the hour. Landlords waive requirements for him. Investors take meetings with him on pure reputation. Because in the world of capital, money does not just buy comfort, it buys trust, and trust is the single most valuable currency in the entire financial system. This is where most people stop the analysis, at the surface level of unfairness, and move on with their day feeling a brief flash of anger or envy. But if we stop there, we miss the real story, the one hiding underneath these two lives, the one that explains not just why this happens to individuals, but why entire economies are built to behave exactly this way. To understand this, you have to go back to a concept economists call access to capital, and once you understand it, an entire hidden layer of society reveals itself. Capital is not just cash sitting in an account. Capital is potential energy. It is the ability to take an opportunity the moment it appears, instead of watching it disappear while you scramble to gather resources. The millionaire sees an undervalued piece of real estate and buys it that same week. The broke 30-year-old sees the exact same opportunity, recognizes it just as clearly, maybe even more clearly because desperation sharpens attention, and can do absolutely nothing about it. Because the money required to act simply does not exist in his world. Opportunity, in a capitalist system, is not distributed based on who sees it first. It is distributed based on who can afford to move first. This single mechanism, the ability to move first, is responsible for an enormous share of the wealth gap you see in society today. It is not entirely about intelligence, and it is not entirely about effort, although both matter. It is about timing multiplied by access, and access is something inherited, built, or denied long before a person turns 30. Now here is where the story becomes genuinely unsettling, because this pattern does not just exist between two individuals in one city. It exists at the level of entire nations, and once you see it at that scale, the personal story of these two men becomes a mirror for something far larger and far more dangerous. Think about how the global financial system treats a wealthy nation compared to a developing one during a crisis. When a wealthy country faces economic trouble, central banks intervene within days. Interest rates get slashed. Stimulus packages get approved. The market almost instantly decides that this country's debt is still safe, still trustworthy, still worth lending to. But when a developing nation faces a similar crisis, capital does not rush in to help. It rushes out to protect itself. Investors pull their money at the very first sign of instability, currencies collapse, borrowing costs spike overnight, and the very system that claims to reward good decision-making instead punishes vulnerability with even more vulnerability. This is the poverty premium, but scaled up to the level of entire populations. And it explains why some countries seem permanently trapped in cycles of debt, while others recover from crisis after crisis almost effortlessly. This is not conspiracy. There is no secret room where powerful people decide who gets to succeed. It is something far more efficient and, in some ways, far more disturbing than a conspiracy. It is a system built over centuries that automatically reinforces existing advantage, not because it is evil, but because trust at scale behaves like a currency of its own, and currencies always flow to wherever they are already strongest. Let's return to our two 30-year-olds, because their story is about to take a turn most viewers do not expect. The broke 30-year-old, against every statistical prediction, starts making progress. Not through a lottery win, not through some overnight miracle, but through something economists call compounding behavior, a term rarely explained in a way normal people can actually use. He does not need to become rich overnight. He needs to change the direction of a handful of decisions and let time do what time always does. Quietly, relentlessly, multiply small advantages into large ones. He starts saving a small percentage of every paycheck before he sees it, automating the decision so willpower is removed from the equation entirely. This single shift, invisible on the surface, begins altering the entire trajectory of his financial life, because money that is never seen is money that is never spent. Meanwhile, our millionaire 30-year-old is not immune to disaster, and this is the twist most people never expect in stories like this. Wealth acquired quickly, especially wealth built on leverage, on borrowed confidence, on assets whose value depends entirely on market sentiment rather than real underlying cash flow, is one of the most fragile things in modern finance. History is filled with young millionaires who looked untouchable at 30 and were financially wiped out by 35, not because they were foolish, but because they mistook access to capital for mastery of capital. Two very different skills that are often confused with each other. This is where market psychology enters the story, and it is one of the most misunderstood forces in all of finance. Humans do not evaluate risk logically. We evaluate risk emotionally, and then we invent logical explanations afterward to justify decisions we already emotionally committed to. The millionaire who watches his portfolio grow feels invincible, and invincibility is dangerous, because it convinces intelligent people to take risks they would never take in a rational state of mind. The broke individual, meanwhile, often becomes hyper-cautious after enough financial pain, sometimes too cautious, missing legitimate opportunities out of fear, shaped by past scarcity. Both extremes, overconfidence and excessive fear, are psychological scars left behind by financial experience, and both can destroy a person's future if left unchecked. Now let's zoom out even further, because as the personal story of these two men is playing out against the backdrop of something much larger, something most people feel in their daily life without ever connecting it to the headlines they scroll past. Inflation. Inflation is often explained to the public using the most boring possible language: prices going up, cost of living increasing, numbers on a chart moving slightly higher. But inflation is not boring. Inflation is one of the most psychologically manipulative forces in the entire economy, and understanding it changes how you see every single price tag for the rest of your life. When a government prints more currency, or when central banks expand the money supply to stimulate an economy during a crisis, that new money does not appear equally in everyone's bank account. It enters the economy through specific channels first, usually financial markets, real estate, and large institutions, before it eventually trickles down to wages and everyday spending, if it trickles down at all. This means the wealthy, who hold assets like stocks, property, and businesses, see the value of what they own inflate almost immediately, while the average worker sees their paycheck slowly lose purchasing power over months and years before wages even begin catching up, if they ever do. Inflation, in other words, is not a neutral economic event. It is a wealth transfer, quiet, gradual, almost invisible, moving value away from people who hold cash and wages and toward people who hold assets. This single mechanism explains something that confuses millions of people every single year: why the economy can technically be growing while ordinary people feel poorer than ever. The economy, not lying. It is simply measuring the wrong thing for the wrong audience, and the gap between what statistics say and what people actually feel in their wallets is where public trust in institutions quietly erodes, year after year, election after election. Now bring this back to our two 30-year-olds, because inflation treats them in dramatically different ways. For the broke individual, every dollar he holds in cash is silently losing value while he sleeps, which means simply saving money is no longer enough to build security. It is barely enough to tread water. For the millionaire, inflation is often not a threat at all. It is an opportunity, because his wealth is stored in assets that historically rise alongside or faster than in inflation itself. This is one of the most important, least discussed truths in personal finance. The system is not just imbalanced in terms of access, it is imbalanced in terms of protection. The wealthy are shielded from the very economic forces that quietly devastate everyone else. At this point, you might expect this spiral into pure hopelessness, but that would be an incomplete version of the truth, because history offers something the headlines rarely mention: moments of dramatic reversal, times when systems that looked permanently rigged shifted with astonishing speed. Consider the years following major financial crises throughout modern history. Each time, in the immediate aftermath, it appeared as though the wealthy had simply been handed another advantage, bailed out while ordinary citizens absorbed the consequences. And in the short term, that pattern often held true. But crises also expose weakness. Once exposed to the public, eventually forces change, sometimes through new regulation, sometimes through shifts in public policy, sometimes through entirely new industries emerging from the wreckage of the old ones. Innovation does not usually come from comfort. It comes pressure. Some of the most significant transfers of wealth in modern history happened not during periods of stability, but during periods of chaos, when asset prices and those with the courage, the information, and yes, the capital to, while others panicked, positioned themselves for the coming recovery. This is the uncomfortable truth hiding inside every financial crisis. Chaos does not destroy wealth, it locates it. And the direction it moves depends entirely on who understands the system well enough to act while everyone else is frozen by fear. This brings us to one of the most overlooked forces shaping the future of both our 30-year-olds and, honestly, the future of nearly everyone watching this right now: debt. Not personal debt alone, but the staggering scale of national debt accumulating across the globe. Governments have discovered that borrowing money is politically easier than raising taxes or cutting spending, which means debt keeps climbing, year after year, decade after decade, quietly becoming the financial inheritance handed to every young person entering adulthood, whether they asked for it or not. Here is the part almost nobody explains clearly. National debt does not simply vanish. It gets managed through one of a small number of mechanisms: economic growth outpacing the debt, which is difficult and slow; austerity, which is politically painful and rare; default, which is catastrophic and almost never chosen voluntarily by major economies; or inflation, which clearly reduces the real value of time while simultaneously reducing the value of everyone's savings along with it. Guess which option governments tend to prefer? Inflation is, in many ways, the path of least political resistance, because it does its damage slowly, invisibly, without ever requiring a politician to stand up and announce a painful decision. This is why understanding inflation is not optional knowledge reserved for economists. It is survival knowledge for anyone trying to build financial security in the modern world. Now, layer geopolitics into this picture. Because currencies, debt and trust do not exist in isolation, they exist in fierce competition on a global stage. The value of a nation's currency, the interest rate must to borrow, the confidence investors place in its stability, all of this is shaped by a constant, largely invisible competition between countries for global trust. When trust shifts even slightly, capital moves, sometimes in staggering amounts within hours. A political conflict on one side of the world can quietly raise the cost of a mortgage on the other side. A shift in global energy supply can alter inflation rates in countries that have nothing directly to do with the source of that shift. Nothing in the modern economy happens in isolation anymore, and the illusion of separation, the idea that global events over there have nothing to do with your bank account over here, is one of the most costly misunderstandings an ordinary person can hold in the modern financial world. This is precisely why the gap between our two 30-year-olds is not simply a personal story. It is a symptom of systemic architecture, built across generations, reinforced by policy, psychology, and the raw mechanics of how trust and capital behave at scale. The broke individual is not simply behind because of his own decisions. He is behind because he was born into, and is now navigating a system engineered, whether intentionally or not, to reward existing advantage and punish existing vulnerability. And the millionaire is not simply ahead because of his own brilliance. He is ahead because he was granted access, trust, and margin for error that the system rarely extends to anyone starting from nothing. And yet, here is where the story is to end in despair, because access is not destiny, it is simply a head start, and history is filled with heads that were eventually closed, sometimes through policy, sometimes through innovation, and sometimes, most powerfully, through individual understanding of the very system this video has just spent several minutes exposing. The broke 30-year-old who understands the poverty premium can begin dismantling it piece by piece, refusing high-interest debt traps, building even small emergency reserves to avoid the desperation that forces bad financial decisions, slowly repairing the trust signals that unlock better rates and better opportunities over time. The millionaire who understands the fragility hiding beneath rapid wealth can protect what he has built by prioritizing real, cash flow generating assets over speculative leverage, understanding that the same psychology that made him feel invincible on the way up can destroy him just as quickly on the way down. Neither man's future is guaranteed. That is the real, unfiltered truth this story is pointing toward. Wealth is not a fixed identity. It is a constantly shifting relationship between decisions, timing, psychology, and forces far larger than any single individual, forces shaped by central banks, government policy, historical cycles, and global events unfolding in places most people will never visit. The millionaire can lose everything through overconfidence and poor risk management. The broke individual can, slowly and unglamorously, build genuine security through discipline, patience, and a refusal to participate in the financial behaviors that keep the poverty premium alive. So here is the question this story leaves you with, and it is not a comfortable one. When you look at your own financial life right now, are your daily decisions being shaped by fear born from scarcity, or by discipline built through understanding? Are you unknowingly feeding the very system that keeps the poverty premium alive? High-interest debt, impulsive spending during moments of emotional stress, avoidance of the very financial education that could shift your trajectory? Or are you, even in small, unglamorous, invisible ways, beginning to build the kind of quiet compounding advantage, given enough time, rewrites which side of this story you eventually stand on? Because the truth this entire journey has been building toward is this: society does not simply treat the wealthy and the poor differently because of arbitrary cruelty or arbitrary kindness. It treats them differently because trust, capital, and access behave according to consistent, learnable, exploitable patterns that have existed for centuries and will continue existing long after both of these 30-year-olds are gone. The system will not change to accommodate ignorance. It rewards, quietly and relentlessly, whoever understands it first. And that leaves you with one final, uncomfortable, unavoidable question hanging in the air as this video ends. Which one of these two men do your current habits, your current fears, your current relationship with money actually resemble right now? And more importantly, which one are you willing to start becoming today?